Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight we're settling in with something darker. A love story, but not the kind with happily ever after. This one's got scandal, murder, and a queen who chose power over everything. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's ease in. Because what you're about to hear? It's heartbreak wrapped in a crown. In 1560, a young noblewoman was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Her neck was broken. Her husband was miles away with the Queen. No witnesses came forward, no investigation was thorough enough. And within weeks everyone in Europe believed the same thing, that the Queen of England had ordered a murder, so she could marry her lover. The dead woman's name was Amy Robsart, her husband was Robert Dudley, and the Queen, Elizabeth the Fearsed, the Virgin Queen, the woman who swore she'd never marry. But here's what most people don't know. Elizabeth and Robert had been in love since they were children. Before she was queen, before he was married, before power got in the way of everything. Their story didn't start with scandal, it started in a prison. But first, let's go back even further, to when they were just kids. The year is 1543. Elizabeth is 10 years old, motherless. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded when Elizabeth was barely 3. Her father, Henry VIII, declared her illegitimate. Bastard. That's the word people whispered when she walked by. She grew up knowing her existence was contested, that her very right to live depended on her father's mood. Robert Dudley is 11, the son of John Dudley, a powerful nobleman climbing the political ladder. Robert has everything Elizabeth doesn't. Legitimacy, a living mother, a father who's gaining power instead of executing wives. But they have one thing in common. They're both precociously smart, dangerously charming, and utterly convinced they're destined for greatness. They meet at court, their families orbit the same circles. Henry VIII's court is a viper pit of ambition and paranoia, and children learn young how to read a room. Elizabeth and Robert study together. Latin, Greek, rhetoric, horsemanship. They're competitive. She's better at languages. He's better at athletics. They argue about everything. Philosophy, politics, who's faster on horseback. And there's something else, a spark. Even at 10 and 11, people notice the way they look at each other, the way they seek each other out at every gathering, the inside jokes, the conspiracies, the stolen moments in gardens and corridors. But childhood doesn't last, not for them. When Henry VIII dies in 1547, Elizabeth is 13. Edward VI, her sickly half-brother, becomes king. Robert's father, now the Duke of Northumberland, becomes the most powerful man in England. And Elizabeth, she's living with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, and Catherine's new husband, Thomas Seymour. This is where things get dark. Thomas Seymour is a predator. He sneaks into teenage Elizabeth's bedroom in his nightshirt, slaps her, tickles her, cuts her dress. While she's wearing it, it's assault disguised as play. And when Catherine Parr catches him, Elizabeth is sent away in disgrace. People blame her. A 14-year-old girl. They say she encouraged him, that she was flirtatious, inappropriate. This teaches Elizabeth a brutal lesson. Men in power are dangerous, and women always get blamed. She doesn't see Robert much during these years. He's off at court, learning the family business of politics and survival. But when tragedy strikes both their families, their paths cross again, in the worst possible place. The Tower of London, 1554. Elizabeth is 20 years old and absolutely terrified. She's been locked in the tower by her own sister, Queen Mary Lacy, accused of plotting treason. She knows what happens to traitors. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded in this very tower. Elizabeth walks the same stones, sleeps in the same cold rooms, wonders if she'll meet the same end. The air smells like damp stone and old fear. Every footstep echoes. She counts the days, writes letters protesting her innocence, prays, waits. A few cells away is Robert Dudley. He's 21, still handsome despite the grime and stress. Still charming despite the fact that his father was executed just months ago. The Duke of Northumberland had tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary. Big mistake. The Duke was beheaded, his head stuck on a pike on London Bridge. Robert watched it happen. Then he was arrested, and now here he is, trapped just like Elizabeth, both facing possible execution, both with nothing to lose. We don't know if they actually saw each other in the Tower. Historical records are frustratingly vague, but Tower prisoners sometimes glimpsed each other during walks in the courtyard, sometimes passed messages through sympathetic guards, sometimes just knew the other was there, suffering the same cold nights and existential dread. It's possible they communicated. It's possible they just knew on some level that they weren't alone, that the person they'd laughed with as children was now facing death in the same building. And here's the thing about trauma. It bonds people forever. Whether they saw each other or not, they survived the Tower together. That shared experience, the fear, the isolation, the proximity to death, would connect them for life. Against all odds, Queen Mary released them both. Elizabeth swore her loyalty, played the dutiful sister. Robert laid low, kept his head down. Literally. Keeping your head was the priority. And when Mary died in 1558, everything changed. Elizabeth became queen. She was 25 years old, unmarried, untested, the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. Half the country thought she was illegitimate. The other half wasn't sure she could rule. Women weren't supposed to rule. It was unnatural, against God's order, against everything the 16th century believed about gender and power. And immediately, everyone had an opinion about what she should do next, specifically who she should marry. Every king, prince and duke in Europe started sending proposals. The King of Spain, the Archduke of Austria, the King of Sweden, the Duke of this, the Prince of that. Marriage proposals arrived weekly, sometimes daily, each one accompanied by portraits, gifts and flowery letters about eternal devotion from men who'd never met her. Even her own brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain, proposed. Philip had been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary. Mary had died less than a year ago, and here was Philip suggesting he just transfer to the new queen, like some kind of monarchical trade-in program. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. But that was royal marriage. It wasn't about love. It was about alliances, trade agreements, and military pacts wrapped in the language of romance. But Elizabeth wasn't interested, not in any of them. Because the moment she took the throne, she did something that shocked everyone. She appointed Robert Dudley as her Master of the Horse. Wait, hold on. Master of the Horse? That sounds like a random job, right? Wrong. This was one of the most prestigious positions at court. It meant Robert would be by Elizabeth's side constantly, riding with her, hunting with her, advising her, basically living in her pocket. And people noticed, immediately. Within months, rumours were flying. The Queen and Robert were inseparable. They danced together at every ball. They rode together every morning. They stayed up late into the night, talking, laughing, playing cards. Courtiers whispered. Foreign ambassadors sent alarmed letters home. Gossip spread through London like plague. And everyone asked the same question: what exactly is going on between them? The Spanish ambassador wrote to Philip II, "Lord Robert has come so much into favour that he does whatever he likes with affairs, and it is even said that Her Majesty visits him in his chamber day and night." Day and night. That's not subtle. That's a scandal. The French ambassador reported that Elizabeth and Robert were seen embracing, that she touched him publicly in ways that made people uncomfortable, that they disappeared together for hours. And the English court, divided, some thought it was romantic, others thought it was mortifying. Many thought Elizabeth was making a catastrophic political mistake. Here's the problem: the massive relationship-destroying, reputation-ruining problem. Robert Dudley was married. He'd married Amy Robsart back in 1550, when they were both teenagers. Amy was from Norfolk gentry, respectable family, good dowry, a perfectly acceptable match for a younger son of an ambitious family. The wedding was lovely, apparently. Public, well-attended, very legal, but by 1559, the marriage was essentially dead. Amy lived in the country. Robert lived at court. They barely saw each other, hadn't shared a bed in years according to some accounts, and Robert made no secret to anyone who'd listen that he wished he were free. Free to marry the Queen. Because let's be honest, Robert Dudley didn't just love Elizabeth, he wanted to be king. He wanted power, wealth, status, and marrying Elizabeth would give him all three. As her husband, he'd rule beside her, share her throne, become one of the most powerful men in Europe. Was it love? Yes. Was it ambition? Also yes. People contain multitudes, especially ambitious Renaissance men who'd watched their father get executed and learned that power was the only thing that mattered. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was navigating the most dangerous job in the world, being an unmarried queen. In the 16th century, the idea of a woman ruling alone was absurd, unnatural, against God's order, against nature, against everything society believed about gender, power, and legitimacy. Everyone, from her advisors to foreign kings to random pamphleteers, insisted she needed a husband. For heirs, for stability, for legitimacy, for someone to make the actual decisions while she looked pretty and produced sons. But Elizabeth had watched what happened to women who married. Her own mother had been executed by her father. Her stepmother, Jane Seymour, died in childbirth. Another stepmother, Catherine Howard, beheaded. Her sister Mary had married Philip of Spain and became a puppet. He'd taken over her foreign policy, pushed England into expensive wars, and everyone knew who was really in charge, not Mary. Marriage for a queen meant losing power, losing autonomy, becoming someone's wife instead of someone's ruler, becoming subordinate to a husband who would, by law, own everything she had, including her kingdom. So Elizabeth did something radical. She refused, all of them. But she didn't refuse Robert. She kept him close, closer than anyone else, closer than was appropriate, closer than was safe, and that's when things got really dangerous. In early 1560, people started talking openly about the Queen marrying Robert. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It wasn't just scandalous whispers. It was a genuine political crisis. Parliament was concerned. Foreign powers were alarmed. Elizabeth's own advisors were horrified. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, wrote that if she married Robert, it would mean utter subversion of the commonweal. That's Tudor speak for this will destroy everything. But Elizabeth didn't care, or maybe she did care, and was just so in love she couldn't help herself. She kept spending time with Robert, kept giving him gifts, kept letting him touch her in public, kept feeding the rumours. The Spanish ambassador wrote home that Elizabeth was in love with Lord Robert and spent all her time with him. He added, rather ominously, that Robert's wife was said to be ill. Some even whispered that she was being poisoned. Let's talk about Amy. Amy Robsart, the forgotten woman in this triangle. Because while Elizabeth and Robert were falling in love, or whatever complicated thing they were doing, Amy was alone in the country, aware that her husband was the subject of national scandal. Can you imagine? Your husband is rumoured to be sleeping with the Queen of England. The entire country is gossiping about it. Foreign ambassadors are writing about it. Cartoons are being drawn. Songs are being sung in taverns. And you're stuck in some manor house in Oxfordshire, completely powerless. Amy had no children. Her marriage was loveless. Her husband hadn't visited in months. And now everyone in England knew he wished she were dead, so he could marry someone else. Some accounts say Amy was depressed. Others say she was ill, possibly with breast cancer. The records describe her as melancholy, withdrawn, in pain. Whether she was actually sick, we don't know. What we do know is that she was isolated, lonely, and aware that her existence was the only thing standing between Robert and the crown. And then, on September 8th, 1560, everything fell apart. Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in Cumnor Place, Oxfordshire. Her neck was broken. She'd been alone in the house. The servants had all been sent away to a local fair, a convenient detail that immediately made everyone suspicious. It looked like an accident, or maybe a suicide, or maybe murder. Nobody believed the accident theory, nobody. Within hours, rumours exploded. Within days, they'd spread across England. Within weeks, all of Europe was talking about the same thing. Robert Dudley had his wife murdered so he could marry the Queen. Or worse, far worse, Elizabeth herself had ordered it. The scandal wasn't just national. It was international, massive, career-destroying. The French court laughed at Elizabeth. The Spanish called her a whore. Protestant allies were disgusted. Catholic enemies had propaganda gold. Even her own advisors were horrified. The English people, who'd been cautiously supportive of their new queen, started to wonder, what kind of woman was ruling them? A woman who'd murder another woman to steal her husband. And Robert. He left court immediately, retreating to his estate, wrote desperate letters to Elizabeth, swore he had nothing to do with Amy's death, begged her to believe him. Elizabeth, for her part, acted swiftly. She ordered a full inquest into Amy's death. She wanted it public, transparent, above reproach. The jury examined the body, interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence, and they ruled accidental death. But the damage was done. The verdict didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, Elizabeth and Robert were guilty. The rumours had taken root, and they would never fully go away. Modern historians mostly believe Amy's death really was an accident, or possibly suicide. She'd been sick, likely with breast cancer, which causes bone fragility. A fall downstairs could easily have been fatal, and the servants sent away detail. That was Amy's own order. She'd insisted they go to the fair. Maybe because she wanted privacy, maybe because she was planning to kill herself. We'll never know. But in 1560, none of that mattered. What mattered was perception. And the perception was that the Queen of England was involved in a murder plot to marry her lover. That was the narrative, the story that would be repeated in pamphlets and plays and gossip for centuries. Elizabeth could never marry Robert now, not without confirming every vicious rumour, not without destroying her reputation entirely, not without admitting that yes, she'd been willing to kill for love. The woman who might have been her rival had died under suspicious circumstances, and whether or not Robert was involved, the appearance of guilt was enough. More than enough. This is where the love story becomes a tragedy. Because here's the thing about impossible choices. Someone always pays. Elizabeth made a choice. The hardest choice of her life, maybe. She kept Robert close, but she would never marry him. She couldn't. The price was too high, and Robert, he stayed. Because leaving her was worse than staying in limbo, because whatever power and position he'd lose by staying unmarried to the Queen was still better than the alternative, leaving her and losing everything. So they entered this strange purgatory, together but not together, in love but unable to marry, committed but free. It would last for decades. After Amy's death, Elizabeth's advisors thought the crisis was over. The worst had passed. Surely now the Queen would distance herself from Robert. Surely now she'd choose a proper, foreign, politically advantageous match. Surely now she'd come to her senses. They were wrong. So wrong. Elizabeth kept Robert at her side. If anything, they grew closer. The scandal had bonded them. Trauma does that. Shared crisis, shared guilt, shared loss. They'd survived something together. Again. She gave him land, titles, money. She made him Earl of Leicester in 1564, a ceremony so intimate and flirtatious that the French ambassador reported she tickled his neck while putting on his robes. In public, in front of everyone. This wasn't subtle. This was Elizabeth saying, I don't care what you think, he's mine. She couldn't marry him, but she wouldn't let him go either. And this is where their relationship becomes fascinating. Because what they had wasn't a traditional romance. It was something weirder, more painful, more real. They fought constantly. Elizabeth had a vicious temper inherited from both her parents. Robert was arrogant and jealous with the confidence of a man who'd almost had everything and lost it. When she flirted with other men, which she did constantly because it was part of her political strategy, Robert sulked, stormed out of rooms, made scenes. Once he apparently got so angry he punched a wall. Another time, he refused to attend court for a week. When Robert paid attention to other women, Elizabeth raged, threw things, threatened to have him imprisoned. Once she apparently threw a slipper at his head during an argument. Another time, she threatened to have him thrown in the tower. But she never did, because she loved him. In whatever complicated, impossible way, she was capable of loving anyone. Let's talk about what William Cecil thought about all this. Because Cecil, later Lord Burghley, was Elizabeth's most trusted advisor, her Secretary of State, the man who basically ran England while Elizabeth dealt with the circus of being Queen. And Cecil hated Robert, absolutely loathed him. Not personally. Well, maybe personally, but mostly politically. Cecil thought Robert was dangerous, too ambitious, too charming, too close to the Queen. Cecil worried that Robert was manipulating Elizabeth, using her affection to gain power. And maybe he was right, but Cecil also understood something crucial. Elizabeth needed Robert. Emotionally, psychologically, Robert was her constant, her connection to her past, the one person who'd known her before she was Queen, before she had to perform every moment of her life, so Cecil couldn't remove him. He tried, God, he tried. He sabotaged Robert's political initiatives. He built alliances against him. He whispered doubts to Elizabeth. He pushed alternative suitors. He did everything short of outright treason to separate them. It never worked, because Elizabeth saw through it. She knew exactly what Cecil was doing, and she didn't care. She'd chosen both of them. Cecil for his brilliant political mind, Robert for something else, something Cecil could never provide. But here's the thing people forget. Elizabeth had very good reasons not to marry. Beyond the political nightmare of marrying Robert specifically, marriage itself was a trap, a cage, a death sentence. In the 16th century, a married woman had no legal rights, zero. Everything she owned belonged to her husband. She couldn't sign contracts, own property, or make decisions without his consent. She was legally subordinate. Property. Chattel. Elizabeth was the Queen of England. If she married, her husband would become king. He'd have authority over her decisions, over her country, over everything she'd fought to control. And English law was clear. The husband was the head of the household, the master, the ruler, even if that household was England. Elizabeth had seen what happened when queens married. Her sister Mary had married Philip of Spain. And what happened? Philip took over. He declared war on France, Mary's war, but Philip's agenda. He appointed Spanish advisors. He treated England as an extension of Spanish foreign policy. Mary had become subordinate, diminished, erased. She'd gone from queen to the king's wife, and when she died childless and bitter, everyone remembered her as Philip's puppet. Elizabeth had watched this, learned from it, and decided never. She would never subordinate herself to any man, not even Robert. So she chose power, but she didn't choose to be alone. She kept Robert. She kept the fantasy alive, and she used it brilliantly. Because here's what Elizabeth understood better than anyone. As long as she was unmarried, she had leverage. Every foreign king wanted to marry her. Every alliance depended on the possibility of marriage. She could dangle the prospect like a carrot, extracting concessions, buying time, playing nations against each other. She did this for decades. The French thought they had a chance, so did the Spanish, the Austrians, the Swedes. Elizabeth entertained every proposal, flirted with every ambassador, made each suitor believe he might be the one, and married none of them. It was a masterclass in political manipulation. Marriage as foreign policy, romance as weapon. But privately, she had Robert, her sweet Robin, her eyes. That's what she called him in letters, her eyes, because he saw her, the real her, not the icon, not the queen, but Elizabeth, the woman who was scared and ambitious and lonely and fierce and human. And Robert played along, because what else could he do? Leave? Marry someone else? Wait, he tried that. In 1578, Robert did the unthinkable. He secretly married Lettice Knollys, one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, in secret, without telling Elizabeth, without asking permission. When Elizabeth found out, and she did find out, because secrets never last at court, she lost it. Completely. Utterly. Catastrophically lost it. She banished Lettice from court, permanently. For life. She refused to speak Lettice's name. Referred to her only as that she-wolf, or the widow. Even after Robert died, Elizabeth kept Lettice banished. For the rest of Elizabeth's life, Lettice was persona non grata. And Robert? Elizabeth didn't speak to him for months. When she finally did, she called him a traitor, said he'd broken her heart, threatened to destroy him, but she took him back, because she always did. Their relationship was toxic in some ways, codependent, impossible, the kind of thing modern therapists would have a field day with. But it was also deeply, genuinely loving. They knew each other better than anyone else did. They'd survived trauma together, multiple traumas, the Tower, the Amy scandal, decades of public scrutiny, decades of impossible choices. They were partners in a way that transcended romance or marriage. They were each other's witnesses. The people who knew the truth about who they'd been before power changed everything. And maybe that was enough. Or maybe it was torture. Probably both. Let's talk about what Robert actually wanted, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Robert Dudley wanted to be king. Not just Earl of Leicester, not just Master of the Horse, king. He wanted to marry Elizabeth, not just because he loved her, but because it would make him the most powerful man in England. Maybe the most powerful man in Europe. And Elizabeth knew this. She wasn't naive. She understood that Robert's ambition was as strong as his affection, maybe stronger, and that made everything more complicated. In the early years, the 1560s, before Amy's death made everything impossible, Robert genuinely believed Elizabeth would marry him. He, à titre, pushed for it. His allies pushed for it. There were petitions, political manoeuvres, whisper campaigns. Some of Elizabeth's advisors thought a marriage might actually stabilise things. After all, Elizabeth needed an heir. The succession crisis was getting dangerous, and she wasn't getting any younger. But Elizabeth kept saying no. Not outright. She was too smart for that. She'd say maybe or soon or we'll see. She'd let the possibility linger like smoke. Just enough to keep Robert hoping. Just enough to keep her council guessing. And the rest of Europe? They were baffled. The Spanish ambassador wrote in 1561 that Elizabeth visits him in his chamber day and night, and that people were thinking of destroying Lord Robert's wife. Even after Amy died, when that clearly didn't happen, the rumours continued. People couldn't understand their relationship because it didn't fit any recognisable pattern. They weren't married. They weren't secretly married. They might have been lovers. They might not have been. We'll never know for sure. Elizabeth's virginity became part of her political brand, the Virgin Queen. But whether it was literal truth or strategic image management is still debated by historians. What we do know is that Robert was possessive, jealous, controlling in the way men of his time were taught to be. When Elizabeth flirted with other suitors, and she did constantly, Robert couldn't hide his fury. He'd storm out of rooms, send passive-aggressive letters, make scenes at court. Once, when Elizabeth was seriously considering the Duke of Anjou, Robert apparently told her that marrying a French Catholic would destroy England. Not because he cared about religion, because he couldn't stand the thought of Elizabeth with someone else. And Elizabeth, she'd punish him for it, then forgive him, then do it again. It's a pattern you see in toxic relationships. Push and pull, closeness and distance, love and cruelty intertwined. But here's the thing. They were also trapped by circumstance, by politics, by the roles they had to play. Elizabeth couldn't marry Robert without destroying herself. Robert couldn't leave Elizabeth without losing everything. So they stayed locked in this dance for decades, hurting each other, needing each other, unable to let go. In 1579, something shifted. Elizabeth was 45 years old, still unmarried, still childless, still, somehow, entertaining marriage proposals. This time, it was the Duke of Anjou, a French prince 20 years her junior. Let's be honest, the Duke of Anjou was not a catch. He was short, pockmarked from smallpox, had a massive nose. Contemporary portraits make him look like a very unfortunate goblin, but he was French royalty, and a French alliance made strategic sense. Elizabeth called him her frog, as a term of endearment apparently, which tells you something about either her sense of humour or her standards. The courtship was absurd. He visited England twice. They exchanged love letters. She gave him a ring. She kissed him in public. People at court actually thought she might go through with it. For the first time in years, it seemed like Elizabeth might actually marry someone who wasn't Robert. Robert was devastated. He wrote her desperate letters, begged her not to marry Anjou, reminded her of their bond, their history, their love. But here's the twist. He wasn't writing as a rejected lover. He was writing as a married man. Because by this point, Robert had been secretly married to Lettice Knollys for over a year. He'd betrayed Elizabeth in the exact way he feared she was betraying him. And when she found out, and she did find out, because secrets at Tudor court lasted about as long as fresh milk in summer, it destroyed something between them. Elizabeth never forgave Lettice. Never. She banished her from court and never allowed her back. For the rest of Elizabeth's life, Lettice was forbidden. The woman who'd stolen Robert. The woman who had what Elizabeth had denied herself. But Elizabeth didn't banish Robert. She couldn't. By this point, he wasn't just her lover or her friend. He was part of her government, her advisor, her connection to the past. Losing him would have been like losing a limb. So she kept him. But things were different now. Colder. The warmth of their early years was gone, replaced by something more bitter, more resigned. They still worked together, still bickered, still needed each other. But the magic, whatever it had been, was fading, and time was running out. Let's talk about Elizabeth's other suitors, all of them, because while Robert was the love of her life, he wasn't the only man who wanted her. Far from it. There was Thomas Seymour, her stepmother's husband, who assaulted teenage Elizabeth in ways that would absolutely get him arrested today. He'd sneak into her bedroom in his nightshirt, slap her bottom, cut her dress to ribbons while she was still wearing it. It was predatory behaviour disguised as playfulness. When it came to light, he was executed, not for assaulting Elizabeth, for trying to kidnap the boy King Edward VI and marry Elizabeth himself to get closer to the throne. But still, he was Elizabeth's first brush with male predation, and it taught her young that men in power were dangerous. Then there was King Philip II of Spain. Yes, her dead sister's husband. He proposed to Elizabeth right after Mary died, literally months later. Philip didn't love Elizabeth. He wanted England. He wanted to keep England under Spanish influence. Elizabeth rejected him politely. Good thing. Because Philip would later try to invade England with the Spanish Armada. Nothing says, "I'm over you," like sending 130 warships to destroy your ex's country. Erik IV of Sweden sent marriage proposals for years. He also sent gifts, lavish gifts, horses, jewels, letters professing eternal devotion. Elizabeth kept the gifts, ignored the proposals. Classic move. Erik eventually went insane. Literally, he was declared mentally unfit too. On a rule, and was probably poisoned. Elizabeth dodged a bullet there. Archduke Charles of Austria was proposed by his brother, the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles seemed nice enough. handsome in his portraits, polite in his letters, but he was Catholic. Elizabeth was Protestant. England was Protestant. Marrying a Catholic would have triggered civil war, religious war, the kind of war that tears countries apart. So, no. The Duke of Alençon, who later became Duke of Anjou, yes, the frog, was the youngest son of Catherine de' Medici. He was French royalty, but essentially powerless. A spare heir, disfigured by smallpox, but he was charming, witty, and he genuinely seemed to like Elizabeth, not just her crown, her. He visited England twice, once in 1579, once in 1581. They wrote each other love letters for years. She called him her frog. He called her his son. It was weird, it was probably partly political theatre, but there was something real there too. Elizabeth actually seemed tempted. She was in her late 40s. The succession crisis was critical. Maybe, people thought, she'd finally given up on Robert and was ready to marry someone appropriate. But in the end, she didn't. Some say she never intended to, that the whole courtship was political theatre to keep France friendly. Others say she genuinely considered it and ultimately couldn't go through with it. Couldn't give up her independence, couldn't subordinate herself to a husband, even a powerless younger one. Either way, Robert hated all of it. Every single suitor was a threat, not just to his place in Elizabeth's life, but to his political influence. If Elizabeth married a foreign prince, that prince would become king. Robert would be sidelined, forgotten. Just another courtier. So he sabotaged them. Subtly, carefully, but effectively. He'd whisper doubts in Elizabeth's ear. He'd rally opposition in Parliament. He'd make life difficult for any ambassador pushing a marriage alliance. And it worked, because Elizabeth didn't want to marry any of them. She wanted the fantasy, the possibility, the power that came from being desired but never possessed. Robert understood this, eventually, and once he did, he stopped pushing for marriage and started playing a different role. Not husband, not king, but something more valuable, her constant, the man who'd always be there, who knew all her secrets, who'd seen her at her worst and stayed anyway. That's what he became, and maybe in the end, that mattered more than a ring. Here's something nobody tells you about Elizabeth. She was terrified of childbirth, absolutely, bone-deep terrified, and honestly, she had every reason to be. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had failed to produce a male heir and was executed. Her stepmother, Jane Seymour, died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. Blood loss, infection. The medical care of the time was essentially pray and hope. Another stepmother, Catherine Howard, was executed before she had the chance to get pregnant. And her sister, Mary the Fayai, had at least 2 false pregnancies swelling up with phantom babies while the whole country waited and whispered. The humiliation destroyed her. Childbirth in the 16th century was horrific. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of infection or hygiene, no real medical intervention beyond prayer, hot water, and guesswork. Women died in labour constantly, frequently, routinely. Even queens, especially queens actually, because royal births were public events, attended by dozens of witnesses. The room was hot, airless, packed with people, more contamination, more ways for things to go catastrophically wrong. Labour could last days. If the baby was breech or the labour stalled, there was nothing doctors could do except wait and watch the mother die. If the mother hemorrhaged, they'd give her wine and pray. If the baby got stuck, they'd sometimes try to cut it out. The mother rarely survived that. Elizabeth knew all this. She'd seen it, lived it. She'd watched her sister Mary swell up twice with false pregnancies, the humiliation and disappointment breaking her. She knew that pregnancy was dangerous and childbirth often fatal, and she decided early on that she would not be destroyed by her own biology. If marriage meant children, and children meant probable death, then marriage wasn't worth it. But here's the complication. England needed an heir, desperately, because if Elizabeth died without children, there'd be a succession crisis, civil war, chaos, foreign invasion. The country could fall apart. Her advisors begged her to marry. Parliament begged her. They didn't care who, just someone. Just produce an heir, secure the succession. But Elizabeth refused to be bullied. She'd say things like, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." Political theatre, yes, but also revealing. She'd chosen her country over everything else. And Robert, he was part of that choice. Because if she'd married him, they might have had children, tried for children. And Elizabeth might have died in childbirth. And then Robert would have been blamed, forever, for killing the Queen. So maybe Elizabeth's refusal to marry him wasn't just about politics. Maybe it was about survival, about not giving anyone, even the man she loved, the power to destroy her. About not dying screaming in a bed surrounded by ineffective doctors and gossiping witnesses. About staying alive, staying in control, staying Elizabeth. By the 1580s, Elizabeth and Robert had settled into a strange kind of domesticity. They weren't married. They weren't even, by most accounts, lovers anymore. But they were inseparable in a different way. Robert was her most trusted advisor on certain matters. He commanded her armies when needed. He organised her entertainments. He knew her moods, her preferences, her weaknesses. He could read her better than anyone, predict her reactions, navigate her temper. When the Spanish Armada threatened England in 1588, yes, Philip II, finally followed through on those invasion threats, Robert was put in charge of Elizabeth's land forces. He organised the defence, he assembled troops at Tilbury. And it was Robert who arranged for Elizabeth to give one of the most famous speeches in English history. She rode to Tilbury in full armour, sat on a white horse, and addressed her troops. "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Robert was there, watching her, protecting her, still devoted after 30 years of impossible love. But time was catching up with both of them. Robert was 55, Elizabeth was 55. They'd survived plots, rebellions, religious wars, foreign invasions, scandals, and each other. But they couldn't survive age. Robert's health was failing. He had stomach cancer, though he didn't know it. The medicine of the time couldn't diagnose it, couldn't treat it. He was in constant pain, losing weight, barely able to eat, vomiting blood sometimes, weak. And Elizabeth, watching him deteriorate, must have known what was coming, must have seen the signs, must have understood that after 3 decades of loving him, she was about to lose him. In August 1588, just weeks after the Armada's defeat, Robert went to take the medicinal waters at Buxton, hoping they'd help. Spoiler, they didn't. Drinking slightly mineral-rich water doesn't cure cancer, but people in the 16th century didn't know that. On his way back to rejoin Elizabeth, he stopped at Cornbury Park, his estate in Oxfordshire. He was too weak to continue, too sick. He wrote Elizabeth a letter, the last letter he'd ever write to her. It was short, tender. He called her his most dear and gracious sovereign. He thanked her for her care and concern. He expressed hope that he'd see her soon, that he'd recover, that they'd have more time, and then he died. September 4th, 1588, alone in his bed, in pain, separated from the woman he'd loved for 40 years, from the woman who'd been his entire world since childhood. Elizabeth received the news a few days later. She was at Richmond Palace. She was reviewing dispatches, dealing with the aftermath of the Armada, managing the endless business of running a kingdom. And someone handed her a letter. "Robert is dead." She locked herself in her room. Immediately. She wouldn't come out. For days, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, wouldn't see anyone. Her advisors knocked, begged, pleaded. She ignored them. Finally, after days of this, they broke down the door. Literally broke it down. Because they were terrified she'd hurt herself, or starve, or just refuse to keep living without him. When they got her to emerge, she was different, harder, colder. Something in her had broken, something essential, the part of her that still remembered how to be soft, how to be vulnerable, How to be human. She kept Robert's last letter in a box beside her bed. On the outside, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "His last letter." Two words that said everything she couldn't say out loud, and she never threw it away. For 15 years, until her own death, she kept it, right there, beside her bed, the last words he'd ever written to her. So here's the question that haunts me. Did Elizabeth regret not marrying Robert? Did she lie awake at night, decades later, wondering what life would have been like if she'd said yes? If she'd chosen love over duty? If she'd been his wife instead of his queen? We'll never know for sure. Elizabeth didn't do confessions. She didn't write memoirs or keep diaries where she poured out her heart. Everything we know about her comes from letters, speeches, and the observations of people around her. And everyone had an agenda. Everyone was trying to shape the narrative. But I think she did regret it. Not in the way people regret bad decisions. Not in the "I should have done things differently" way. But in the way you regret impossible choices. The kind where there's no right answer. Only consequences. If she'd married Robert, she might have been happy. For a while. But she also would have lost her throne, her power, her independence. The Privy Council would have revolted. Foreign powers would have seen her as weak, compromised, controlled by a man suspected of murdering his wife. And if she died in childbirth, which was likely, her entire legacy would have been reduced to the queen who married her lover and died bearing his child. A tragedy, a cautionary tale, not the icon she became. So she chose differently. She chose to be the Virgin Queen, the untouchable, unpossessable icon, the woman who belonged to England, not to any man, the ruler who proved women could rule alone and rule well. But Robert paid the price. He spent his entire adult life loving someone he couldn't have, married to someone he didn't love, trapped in a relationship that gave him everything, except the one thing he wanted most: legitimacy, recognition, the right to call Elizabeth his wife. And Elizabeth paid too. She died alone. No husband, no children, no one to hold her hand at the end except her ladies-in-waiting, who were probably terrified of her, even as she was dying. No one who'd known her before she was queen. No one who remembered the girl in the tower, scared and uncertain and young. But she also died as Elizabeth the queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, who navigated the Reformation, who ruled for 45 years without ceding power to anyone. That was her legacy, and maybe, to her, it was worth it. Let's talk about what happened after Robert died, because Elizabeth didn't just mourn and move on like a reasonable person processing grief. She spiraled. Hard. In the years following his death, she became more paranoid, more controlling, more ruthless. The softness that Robert had brought out in her, the ability to laugh, to play, to be foolish sometimes, vanished. She executed the Earl of Essex in 1601. Essex was a young nobleman she'd favoured after Robert. Died handsome, arrogant, reminded people of a young Robert Dudley. Elizabeth had showered him with attention, titles, affection. He'd been her new favourite, her new companion, her attempt to fill the Robert-shaped hole in her life. But Essex wasn't Robert. He was reckless where Robert had been calculated, foolish where Robert had been shrewd. And when he led a failed coup against Elizabeth's advisors, she had him executed without hesitation, without mercy, without the forgiveness she'd always shown Robert. Because here's the thing about Elizabeth, she could love you and still destroy you. She could mourn you and move on. She could be vulnerable and ruthless at the same time. That's what made her terrifying and effective. She crushed Irish uprisings with brutal efficiency. She refused to name a successor, keeping everyone in a constant state of anxiety about what would happen when she died. She became the paranoid old queen, isolated and feared. Some historians think she was depressed, clinical depression, grief that never resolved. Others think she was just getting older and more isolated, as old people do. But I think she was grieving. For Robert, for the life she didn't have, for the version of herself that died with him. Because no one ever replaced Robert. Not really. Essex tried. Other favourites came and went. But none of them had been there from the beginning. None of them had survived the tower with her. None of them had known her before she had to perform every moment of her life. Robert had been there when she was just Elizabeth there, not the icon, not the Virgin Queen. Just a scared girl who wanted impossible things. And when he died, that part of her died too. In 1603, Elizabeth was dying. She was 69 years old, which was ancient for the time. She'd outlived almost everyone she loved. Her advisors, her friends, her enemies, and of course Robert. Always Robert. She refused to go to bed. That's one of the most heartbreaking details historians have preserved. Her doctors begged her to lie down, to rest, to let them help her. But Elizabeth insisted on staying upright. She sat on cushions on the floor, propped against pillows, because she believed that if she lay down, she'd never get up again. And maybe she was right. When she finally did allow them to move her to her bed, she died within days. March 24th, 1603, the end of the Tudor dynasty. In her final hours, she couldn't speak. She'd lost her voice. The woman who'd given some of the greatest speeches in English history, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," died silent, unable to say goodbye, unable to give final commands, unable to control even her own death. But when her advisors asked her to confirm that James VI of Scotland should be her successor, she allegedly raised her hand to her head, indicating a crown, a silent endorsement of the man who would become James III of England. Her last political act, performed without words, and then she was gone. The Virgin Queen, the last of the Tudors, the woman who chose power over love, duty over desire, and England over everything else. But here's what gets me. When they went through her belongings after she died, they found Robert's letter, the one marked his last letter in her handwriting, still in the box beside her bed. She'd kept it for 15 years, through wars, rebellions, political crises, and countless other dramas. Through everything, she'd kept it. That tells you everything you need to know about how she really felt. Not the public persona, not the speeches or the propaganda, or the carefully crafted image. Just a woman who loved someone and lost him, and couldn't let go of the last piece she had left. So was their love story real, or was it political theatre? Was Elizabeth truly in love, or was Robert just useful? Did they sleep together, or was the whole thing chaste? Honestly, I think it was all of the above. Real and performed. Love and strategy. Physical and political. Sacred and transactional. Because people are complicated, especially people with that much power and that much to lose. Elizabeth couldn't afford to just be in love. Every relationship she had was scrutinised, weaponised, politicised. Robert couldn't afford to just be a husband. He had ambitions, enemies, responsibilities, legacy to build. So they navigated this impossible middle ground. Lovers without marriage, partners without equality, devoted to each other but unable to fully commit, locked in this dance where both people were leading and following at the same time. And in a way, that's the most human part of their story. The messiness, the contradictions, the fact that they hurt each other and stayed anyway. That's not a fairy tale. That's real life, especially for people trapped by duty and expectation and the roles they were born into. Let me tell you about the letters, because the letters are where you really see who they were to each other, where the performance drops and the truth bleeds through. Elizabeth and Robert wrote to each other constantly. When they were apart, which was often because Elizabeth sent Robert on diplomatic missions and military campaigns, they exchanged letters almost daily, compulsively, obsessively. Most of those letters are lost now, destroyed probably because they were too revealing, too dangerous, too intimate. After Elizabeth died, someone, probably her advisors, went through her papers and burned anything that might damage her carefully constructed legacy. But the ones that survive give us glimpses into their private world, and they're fascinating, tender, cruel, desperate, all of it. Robert called her most dear and gracious sovereign in public letters, the ones meant to be read by others. But in private, the tone shifted. He called her his dear lady, his dearest. He signed letters with symbols and codes. He wrote about missing her, needing her, being tormented by separation from her. One letter from 1566 survives where Robert writes, "I live only for the moment when I can see you again." Another from 1575, "My heart is yours forever, though my person must serve England." The kind of stuff that sounds romantic, but also kind of heartbreaking when you remember he's basically saying, "I love you, but we'll never be together properly." And Elizabeth, she was more guarded. She had to be. Everything she wrote could be used against her, could be leaked, could be turned into propaganda. So she was careful, controlled, but she let things slip. She called him Robin, sweet Robin, my eyes. She wrote about trusting him more than anyone else, about relying on him, about needing his counsel and his presence, about feeling lost when he was away. But she also wrote cruel things. When he married Lettice without her permission, she sent him a letter so scathing that he reportedly wept when he read it. She called him a traitor, said he'd broken her heart, threatened to destroy him, said she'd never forgive him, and then, of course, she forgave him. Because that's what they did. They'd wound each other, then heal each other, then wound each other again. Over and over, for 40 years. A cycle of hurt and repair that defined their relationship. One of the most revealing letters came in 1578 after Robert secretly married Lettice. Elizabeth wrote to him, "We do utterly mislike of any such matter as we have heard of late. And if you think to rule us as you have done others, you are deceived." Translation: you married another woman and thought I wouldn't care. Cute. But you don't control me, I control you. Never forget who wears the crown here. And that was the dynamic. Elizabeth always had the upper hand. She was the queen. She had the power, the authority, the final word on everything. But Robert had something she didn't, the freedom to leave. And he never did. That was his power, his choice to stay, his daily decision to remain in this impossible situation instead of running away and building a life elsewhere. Let's talk about the physical side of their relationship, because this is the part everyone's curious about and the part we'll never fully know. Did they or didn't they? Did Elizabeth and Robert sleep together? Maybe, maybe not. Probably, possibly. Historians have been arguing about this for 400 years and we're no closer to a definitive answer. Here's what we know. They spent a lot of time alone together. Unusually so. Scandalously so. Foreign ambassadors reported that Robert visited Elizabeth in her private chambers late at night, that they were seen embracing, touching, that the court believed they were lovers, that it was assumed, whispered, gossiped about as fact. But Elizabeth's virginity was part of her brand, part of her political identity. The Virgin Queen wasn't just a title, it was a strategy. As long as she was unmarried and potentially virginal, she had leverage. She could entertain marriage proposals from foreign princes, play nations against each other, keep everyone guessing about who might win her hand. If she'd openly slept with Robert, that leverage would have evaporated. She'd be seen as damaged goods. Horrifying phrase, but true for the time. Her value on the international marriage market would have plummeted. No foreign prince wants to marry someone's mistress, so if they were physical, they hid it very carefully. And if they weren't, they let people think they were, because the rumour of a romance was almost as useful as the reality. It kept Robert bound to her. It satisfied some of her emotional needs. It made her seem desirable, passionate, human. There's also the question of Elizabeth's feelings about sex itself. She'd witnessed her father's marriages, and their violent ends. She'd been sexually harassed by Thomas Seymour as a teenager. She'd seen women destroyed by pregnancy and childbirth. Sex for Elizabeth wasn't just pleasure. It was danger, risk, potential death. So maybe she and Robert never consummated their relationship. Maybe they were deeply romantic, but physically chaste. Maybe they kissed and touched, but never went further. Maybe they found ways to be intimate without risking pregnancy. People have been figuring that out for centuries. Or maybe they did sleep together and were just incredibly careful. Maybe that's why Elizabeth never got pregnant. Maybe she used herbs or methods passed down through women's networks. We'll never know. The point is, we don't know. And maybe that's appropriate, because their relationship was always about ambiguity, about existing in the space between official and unofficial, public and private, love and duty, marriage and freedom. They were Schrödinger's lovers, both together and not together, both committed and free, both everything and nothing to each other. Let me tell you about the worst fight they ever had, the one that almost ended everything, the nuclear option. It was 1566. Elizabeth had been queen for 8 years. Robert had been by her side the whole time. And tensions were reaching a breaking point, a crisis point, the kind of fight that either destroys a relationship or transforms it. Parliament was pressuring Elizabeth to marry, constantly, relentlessly. The succession crisis was becoming dangerous. If Elizabeth died without an heir, England would descend into chaos, civil war, foreign invasion, the end of the Tudor dynasty. Everything her father had built would collapse. Elizabeth's advisors begged her to choose someone. Anyone. Just name a successor or get married and have a child. Do something. But Elizabeth refused. She saw it as a trap. Because the moment she named a successor, that person would become a rival, a focal point for dissent, a reason for people to wish her dead, to plot against her, to wait for her to die. It was a legitimate fear. History was full of heirs murdering monarchs to speed up their inheritance, full of ambitious nobles rallying around the next in line to overthrow the current ruler. Elizabeth had survived enough plots to know naming a successor was painting a target on your own back. Robert, meanwhile, was pushing harder than ever for marriage, not to someone else, to him. He believed, or wanted to believe, that she'd eventually say yes, that all the delays and excuses, and not yet, and maybe, were just Elizabeth being cautious, political, that she'd come around, that she'd marry him eventually. But she wasn't going to come around. And deep down, he was starting to realise it. During one particularly heated argument, we don't know exactly what triggered it, the records are frustratingly vague, Robert apparently said something unforgivable, crossed a line that should never be crossed. Maybe he questioned her judgment. Maybe he accused her of leading him on. Maybe he said what everyone was thinking, but no one dared say that she was selfish, that she was putting her own power ahead of England's safety. Whatever he said, it detonated. Elizabeth exploded. She told him to leave court, immediately. She said she never wanted to see him again, that he was arrogant, presumptuous, out of line, that he'd forgotten his place, that he was a subject, nothing more, and she was done with him. Robert left, went to his estate, sulked, wrote her desperate apology letters, begged for forgiveness, swore he'd been wrong, that he loved her, that he'd serve her forever, that he was nothing without her. And Elizabeth? She didn't respond. For weeks, just silence. The court held its breath. Everyone assumed Robert was finished, that he'd finally pushed the Queen too far, that this time she wouldn't forgive him. But then, slowly, she relented. She invited him back, not with warmth, not with forgiveness, but with the cold understanding that she needed him, that despite everything, he was still the person she trusted most, that their bond was stronger than anger. And Robert came back, because what else was he going to do? This fight is important because it shows the power dynamics of their relationship. Elizabeth always had the final word. She could banish him, humiliate him, destroy him, with a single command. And he knew it. He lived with that knowledge every day, but she never did. Not permanently, because as much power as she had over him, he had power over her too. Emotional power. The power of being needed, of being loved, of being the one person who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and stayed. That's what made their relationship work. For decades, it wasn't equal, but it was balanced, precariously, beautifully, impossibly balanced. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Lettice Knollys, Robert's second wife. The woman Elizabeth hated so much she banished her from court for life. Let's talk about her. Because Lettice is fascinating and tragic, and got a raw deal from history. Lettice was Elizabeth's cousin, distantly. She was also one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, which meant she was supposed to be loyal, devoted, subordinate. She was at court to serve the Queen, to be Elizabeth's companion, her attendant, basically her well-born servant. Instead, she seduced Robert, or Robert seduced her, or they fell in love. However it started, it ended with them secretly married in 1578. No one knows exactly when. The records are vague, but by the time Elizabeth found out, Lettice was pregnant with Robert's child. And Elizabeth, she lost her mind. Completely, utterly, spectacularly lost it. She called Lettice a she-wolf, refused to speak her name, banned her from court permanently. Even after Robert died 10 years later, Elizabeth kept Lettice banished. For the rest of Elizabeth's life, Lettice was persona non grata, forbidden, erased. Why such intense hatred? Because Lettice had something Elizabeth didn't, something Elizabeth had denied herself for political reasons, something that represented everything Elizabeth had sacrificed. Robert's ring, his name, the legitimacy of marriage. Lettice got to be Robert's wife. She got to live with him in his estate, sleep in his bed every night, have his child, be introduced as Lady Leicester, Countess of Leicester, have a legal, recognised public relationship. All the things Elizabeth couldn't have, not because she didn't want them, she did, but because the price was too high. Because being queen meant giving up being a wife, and Elizabeth never forgave Lettice for having what she'd been denied. Not because Lettice stole Robert. By 1578, Robert and Elizabeth's romance was mostly dead anyway, but because it was a reminder, a painful, constant reminder of what Elizabeth had sacrificed. Lettice, for her part, lived to be 90 years old. She outlived Robert by 36 years, outlived Elizabeth by 31 years, and reportedly, she never stopped talking about how much Robert had loved her, how their marriage had been real, passionate, true. Which, fine, maybe it was. But you know what else was true? Robert kept Elizabeth's letters until the day he died. He wore a ring she gave him. He never stopped calling her his sovereign, his lady, his queen. So maybe he loved both of them. Or maybe he loved Elizabeth and married Lettice because he finally accepted he couldn't have what he really wanted. Or maybe love is complicated and people contain multitudes and we'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain, Lettice got Robert's name, Elizabeth got his heart, and neither woman was fully satisfied with her share. Let's talk about what Robert Dudley was actually like as a person, because it's easy to romanticize him as this devoted lover who pined for Elizabeth his whole life. But the reality was messier, more complicated, more human. Robert was ambitious, ruthlessly so. He wanted power, wealth, status, and aligning himself with Elizabeth gave him all three. As her favourite, he had access to the Queen's ear. He could influence policy, secure titles for his allies, enrich himself through royal patronage. He was also vain. He spent enormous amounts of money on clothes, jewels, estates. He threw lavish parties. He cared deeply about his image, about being seen as powerful, as magnificent, as worthy of a queen. And he was arrogant. He genuinely seemed to believe he deserved to be king. that his lineage, despite his father being a traitor, and his abilities entitled him to the throne. When Elizabeth refused to marry him, he didn't just accept it gracefully. He sulked, schemed, tried to force her hand through political pressure and public opinion. But he wasn't just an ambitious, vain, arrogant courtier. He was also capable, intelligent, talented. He was a skilled military commander. He led English forces in the Netherlands during the war against Spain. He wasn't always successful. Military leadership is hard, but he tried. He commanded armies, made strategic decisions, represented England abroad. He was also, according to many accounts, genuinely kind to the people around him. He was generous with his wealth, loyal to his friends, protective of his family. People who worked for him generally liked him, which wasn't true of every powerful Tudor nobleman. And he was devoted to Elizabeth. Whatever else was true, ambition, vanity, arrogance, he loved her, genuinely, deeply, probably more than he loved anyone else in his life, including his wives. Because here's the thing, Robert was married twice, first to Amy, then to Lettice, but he never really belonged to either of them. He belonged to Elizabeth, always, from the moment they met as children until the day he died. So who was Robert Dudley really? A devoted lover? A cynical opportunist? A capable statesman? A jealous, possessive man? An ambitious climber? A generous friend? All of the above, because people aren't one thing, especially people in positions of power. They're contradictions. They're capable of love and manipulation, loyalty and betrayal, selflessness and greed, nobility and pettiness. Robert loved Elizabeth, but he also used her, and she loved him, but she also used him. That's what made their relationship so fascinating. It was real and transactional, emotional and political, true and performative, all at the same time. And in the end, it didn't matter whether Robert was a hero or a villain or something in between. What mattered was that he stayed for 40 years, through scandals and fights and disappointments, and the slow realization that he'd never get what he wanted most. He stayed, and Elizabeth, who trusted almost no one, trusted him. That's the real love story. Let's talk about Elizabeth's other great love. Not a person this time. England, her country, her kingdom, the realm she chose over everything else. Because here's the thing people forget when they romanticize the Elizabeth-Robert story. Elizabeth genuinely loved her country more than she loved any individual person, including Robert, including herself. She said it explicitly, over and over, in speeches to Parliament, in letters to foreign ambassadors, in private conversations with her advisors. I'm married to England. It wasn't just a line, it wasn't just political theatre, it was her core identity, and she proved it. When she had to choose between Robert and her throne, she chose the throne. When she had to choose between marriage and power, she chose power. When she had to choose between personal happiness and political stability, she chose politics every single time. This is what makes Elizabeth I so extraordinary and so tragic. She understood in a way most monarchs didn't, that being a ruler meant giving up the things most people take for granted. Love, family, privacy, choice, normal human connections. She couldn't marry Robert without causing a political catastrophe. She couldn't marry a foreign prince without ceding power to a man who'd inevitably try to control her. She couldn't remain unmarried without facing constant pressure, criticism, and threats to her legitimacy. So she invented a new model, the Virgin Queen, the woman married to her country, the ruler who didn't need a husband because she was complete in herself. She turned her unmarried status into a strength instead of a weakness. Was it lonely? Absolutely. Was it painful? Constantly. Was it worth it? That depends on how you measure worth. Elizabeth's reign lasted 45 years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She navigated the Reformation without plunging England into civil war. She turned England from a second-rate power into a major player on the world stage. She presided over a cultural golden age that included Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer. She proved that a woman could rule alone, could rule well, could be strong, strategic, effective, that queens didn't need kings, that female authority was legitimate. That's her legacy. Not the love affair with Robert, not the Virgin Queen mythology, her actual accomplishments as a ruler. But the personal cost was enormous. She died alone, childless, having spent her entire adult life performing a role she could never step out of. She never got to just be Elizabeth. She was always Elizabeth the Phoenix, the Queen, the icon, the symbol. And Robert? He was the one person who remembered who she'd been before all that. The girl in the tower, the uncertain young queen, the woman who laughed and danced and maybe, for a brief moment, allowed herself to want something just for herself. That's why she kept his last letter. Not because she regretted not marrying him, but because he represented the part of her life that was hers. Not England's, not Parliament's, not history's, hers. I want to talk about the moment Elizabeth realised she'd never marry Robert. The exact moment when fantasy became reality and hope became grief. It was probably sometime in late 1560, after Amy Robsart's death, when the scandal was at its peak and every foreign court was laughing at her, when her own advisors were horrified, when even Robert's friends were telling him to leave court and let things cool down, when the gossip was so bad that Spanish ambassadors were writing home about how the English Queen was probably a murderer. Elizabeth was 27 years old. She'd been queen for 2 years. She was at the height of her beauty, her power, her options. The world was open to her, and she was in love with a man she couldn't have. Can you imagine that moment when you realise the thing you want most is the one thing you can never allow yourself to have? When duty and desire are pulling you in opposite directions and there's no compromise possible, no middle ground, no way to have both? She could have said yes anyway. Technically, she was the Queen of England. She had absolute power. She could have married Robert and told the world to deal with it. Damn the consequences. Choose love over everything. But she didn't. Because she understood something crucial. Power is perception. Authority depends on legitimacy. The moment people stopped seeing her as fit to rule, as competent, as divinely ordained, as legitimate, she'd lose everything. Not just her throne, her life. History is full of deposed monarchs who ended up executed. And marrying the man suspected of murdering his wife to marry the Queen, that would have destroyed her legitimacy completely. It would have confirmed every vicious rumour, validated every criticism, proven that she was weak, emotional, controlled by a man unfit to rule. So she made the hardest choice of her life. She kept Robert, kept him close, kept the relationship alive in some strange, undefined way. But she gave up the fantasy of marrying him. She accepted that she could have him or the throne, not both, and that choice shaped the rest of her reign. Because once you make a sacrifice that big, you can't take it back. You can't say, actually, never mind, and reverse course. You have to double down. You have to make it worth it. You have to turn your sacrifice into something meaningful. And Elizabeth did. She turned her unmarried status into a weapon. She used it to keep foreign powers guessing. She used it to maintain independence. She used it to build a mythology around herself that lasted centuries. The Virgin Queen, the woman who chose England over everything. But I wonder if she ever allowed herself to grieve what she'd given up. If she ever sat alone in her chambers late at night and let herself cry for the life she didn't get to have, the wedding that never happened, the children she never bore, the husband who would have been hers in name as well as heart, the normal human existence she'd traded for power. Or if she was too strong for that, too disciplined, too committed to the role she'd chosen, too afraid to let herself be vulnerable even in private because vulnerability was dangerous, because queens who showed weakness got destroyed. I hope she cried. I hope she let herself be human, at least sometimes. Because the alternative, that she really did sacrifice her entire emotional life, without regret, without grief, without ever looking back, is too sad to contemplate, too cold, too tragic. Let me tell you about the end of Elizabeth's life, the final years when everything she'd built was still standing, but she was exhausted, brittle, done. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s, ancient for the time. She'd outlived most of her generation. Robert was dead. William Cecil was dead. Most of her trusted advisors were dead. Her enemies were dead. She was surrounded by younger courtiers who hadn't known her in her prime, who saw her as the old queen, the icon, the monument, not the woman. She still wore elaborate gowns and wigs and makeup. She still held court and gave speeches and terrified her advisors, but she was tired. You can see it in the later portraits. Her face is a mask, white lead paint covering the wrinkles, red wigs covering the grey hair, jewels covering the age, layers and layers of performance covering the exhaustion underneath. She never named a successor, right up until the end, because naming a successor meant admitting she was going to die, and Elizabeth had spent her entire reign defying expectations, defying nature, defying death itself. Why stop now? But she knew. Of course she knew. She was dying. Slowly. Her health had been declining for years, and there was no one left who really knew her. No one who remembered the girl she'd been, the woman behind the crown. Robert was gone. That connection to her past, to her humanity, was severed. In March 1603, she finally allowed herself to stop, to rest, to let go. She'd ruled for 45 years. She'd survived assassination plots, religious wars, foreign invasions, and her own government's attempts to control her. She'd done what everyone said was impossible, ruled as a woman alone without a husband, and been successful. More than successful, legendary. But success doesn't mean happiness. And as she lay dying, surrounded by advisors and servants, and people who loved her title more than her person, I wonder what she thought about. Did she think about Robert? About the life they didn't have? About the children who were never born? About the moments of joy they'd stolen in between the duty and the performance? Or did she think about England? About her legacy? About whether she'd done enough? About whether it had all been worth it? We'll never know. Elizabeth didn't do deathbed confessions. She died as she lived, in control, silent about the things that mattered most, performing queenship until her final breath. But she kept Robert's letter, right to the end. His last letter, still marked in her handwriting, still treasured, still the last piece of him she had left. That tells you everything. So here's my final thought on Elizabeth and Robert. Their love story. This impossible, painful, decades-long dance of two people who wanted each other but couldn't have each other in any conventional way. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. There was no happy ending, no wedding, no children, no growing old together in peace, no contentment, no resolution, just decades of wanting and not having and staying anyway. But it was real, deeply, painfully, impossibly real. They loved each other in the only way they could, imperfectly, across impossible circumstances, with all the baggage of power and politics and duty weighing them down, with all the trauma of their pasts and the pressure of their presents making every moment complicated. Robert wanted to marry her. Elizabeth wanted to be free. Neither got exactly what they wanted, but they got each other. For 40 years, through everything, through scandals and fights and betrayals and disappointments and the slow, grinding realization that their love would never look like anyone else's love. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the fact that they stayed matters more than how they stayed. Maybe the fact that Elizabeth kept his letter for 15 years says more about her feelings than any grand romantic gesture could have. Maybe their messy, complicated, unconventional relationship was more real than any perfect fairy tale. Because love isn't always neat. It's not always culminating in marriage and babies and happily ever after. Sometimes love is choosing to stay, even when you can't have what you want. Sometimes it's keeping a letter in a box by your bed. Sometimes it's being each other's constant in a world that's constantly changing. Sometimes it's hurting each other and healing each other over and over, and never quite getting it right, but never quite giving up either. Elizabeth and Robert's love story is messy, complicated, frustrating, tragic, unfair, but it's also human. And that's what makes it worth telling. That's what makes it matter. That's what makes it resonate across 400 years. They were two people trapped by their circumstances, by history, by duty, by ambition, by the roles they were born into and the expectations they couldn't escape. And they chose each other anyway. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, deeply, for their entire lives. And when Robert died, Elizabeth mourned him, privately, quietly, in the way she did everything important, without fanfare, without drama, without public displays, just grief, deep bone-level grief for the man who'd been her constant, her witness, her connection to who she'd been before everything changed. And when Elizabeth died 15 years later, she was still holding on to him, in the form of a letter, a memory, a connection to the part of her life that was hers alone. Not England's, not history's, just hers. That's love. Not the fairy tale kind, the real kind, the kind that doesn't fit into neat categories or satisfying endings, the kind that exists in the spaces between what's possible and what's wanted, the kind that just is. So tonight, as you're falling asleep, maybe think about them. Elizabeth and Robert, the Queen and her sweet Robin, two people who wanted impossible things and stayed together anyway. Two people who loved each other across every obstacle history could throw at them. Two people who chose each other even when they couldn't have each other. Their story isn't comforting. It's not a bedtime story in the traditional sense, but it's true. And sometimes truth is more valuable than comfort. Sometimes the messy, complicated, imperfect reality of human connection matters more than any sanitized fairy tale. Sleep well, and remember, history isn't just dates and facts and battles and treaties, it's people. Messy, complicated, contradictory people who wanted things they couldn't have, and loved people they couldn't keep, and made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. People just like us. Good night.